You won't believe what happened when the new HOA president decided my personal yacht was an eyesore and had it towed right out of my driveway, without notice, without warning, and without the slightest idea who she was messing with. I had just returned from a quiet fishing trip on Lake Emerald, still smelling faintly of salt and diesel, when I noticed a long stretch of my driveway looking empty. Not just empty, wrong. My 38-foot Sea Ray yacht, Blue Justice, was gone. At first, I thought maybe my son had borrowed it. But when I saw the bright pink violation sticker slapped on my mailbox, my blood started to simmer. Vehicle removed under HOA Code 7.1. Unauthorized large recreational equipment. That was funny, because I was authorized. Not just by the law. I was the law. Retired now, sure, but 26 years in the commissioner's seat and still respected in these parts. At least, until Vanessa Bray took over our homeowners association. Vanessa had moved in 3 months ago and within a week turned the peaceful Lakeview neighborhood into a petty battlefield. Suddenly mailboxes were non-uniform, porch lights too bright, and wind chimes too loud. And now, apparently, a boat parked in my extra-long, HOA-compliant driveway was enough to reduce curb appeal. Blue Justice wasn't just a boat. It was a symbol of everything I'd worked for. Every mission, every sleepless night during hurricanes, every high-profile case I cracked. And now, some power-drunk suburban Barbie thought she could tow it like it was abandoned trash. I stormed inside and opened my file drawer. Permits, titles, even the email exchange from the previous HOA board confirming that yes, my yacht was grandfathered in and exempt from the new vehicle storage restrictions. I had paperwork stacked thicker than her sense of entitlement. I walked outside and saw Vanessa across the street, sipping from a wine glass in the middle of the day, wearing a silk robe and holding her HOA clipboard like a sheriff's badge. Her smirk widened as I walked across the lawn. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she chirped. I could feel the heat rising behind my eyes. I asked her where my boat was. She didn't even flinch. "Oh, that old thing? It's been towed. We're cleaning up the neighborhood. Appearances matter, you know." I asked her which towing company. She laughed. "Not your concern. It'll be safer wherever it is. Besides, maybe it's time to downsize." That's when I knew she had no clue who I was, or what she had just triggered. You see, I may be retired from the commissioner's office, but I never turned in my Rolodex. I still had numbers that could shake trees all the way up to the state capitol. But I didn't call anyone, not yet. No, I decided to let this play out. Sometimes justice tastes sweeter when you let the wrongdoer dig their own grave with their own pride. That evening, I went through our HOA charter. Vanessa had been making some bold decisions, but I had a feeling she wasn't following protocol. Sure enough, I found multiple votes recorded without quorum, violation notices issued without board review, and worse, financial authorizations for property modifications that had no matching receipts. She was running the HOA like a one-woman show. But here's where it gets even better. A neighbor, sweet Mr. Henderson, came by to drop off an envelope. "I think this belongs to you," he said, handing me a printed HOA email that had accidentally been CC'd to him. Inside was a message from Vanessa instructing the towing company to get rid of the boat by any means necessary, followed by a smiley face emoji. That was all I needed. The next morning, I suited up, not for court, but for business. I headed down to the impound yard where I found my Blue Justice crammed between a rusted RV and a busted food truck. The guy at the desk looked confused when I showed him my documents. "They told us it was junk," he said. I told him it was worth more than his entire facility. I recorded everything: the damages to the hull, the exposed equipment, the water pump they'd broken while hauling it off with a chain like it was a trailer hitch. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was ready. That evening, I filed an injunction against the HOA. Vanessa would be served in the morning. I didn't even have to do it myself. My former deputy now worked as a court officer and volunteered for the job. By the next day, half the neighborhood was talking. The story had started to leak. Neighbors began knocking on my door. One told me Vanessa had fined her for having a trampoline visible from the street. Another whispered that Vanessa had been charging admin fees for HOA paperwork in cash. One after another, they came forward. By sunset, I wasn't the only one preparing a legal response. Vanessa didn't know she hadn't just towed a boat. She had ignited a community firestorm. The following morning started with a knock on my door and the sight of Vanessa pacing on her porch in a state of confusion. She was wearing the same silk robe as yesterday, but looked less composed, her phone glued to her ear, probably trying to reach someone who could explain the legal document she'd just been served. I sipped my coffee and smiled. Blue Justice was back in my driveway, covered in a protective tarp, while I stood next to it with a clipboard of my own, every scratch, every dent meticulously documented. The legal complaint wasn't just about the unauthorized towing. It was about abuse of power, property damage, harassment, and violation of homeowner rights under both state and federal statutes. And I wasn't filing alone anymore. By noon, other residents had joined me at my kitchen table, each one holding some form of complaint against Vanessa's actions. Mrs. Diaz, a retired teacher, revealed that she had been fined $300 for having potted plants on her porch steps. A young couple, the Harpers, had been threatened with foreclosure for hanging a pride flag during a holiday week. And Mr. Chun, our quiet neighbor at the cul-de-sac's end, had been charged with repeated noise violations despite being nearly deaf and living alone. What Vanessa didn't realize was that she'd united an entire neighborhood against her. That afternoon, I received an anonymous email from a former HOA board member. Attached was a PDF of Vanessa's board election documents. Except there was a problem. The date on her swearing-in predated the actual election by 2 weeks. In short, she'd forged her rise to power. I printed every page and added it to the folder I was preparing for the county. I knew some good people still working in oversight and ethics, and one phone call later, an investigation was quietly initiated. Meanwhile, word continued to spread. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with comments, photos, and stories about Vanessa's reign. Someone posted a video of her yelling at a teenager for skateboarding near the mailbox cluster. Another showed her measuring a driveway with a yardstick and shaking her head in disapproval. But the real twist came 2 days later when a black SUV parked in front of my house. Not law enforcement this time, but a news crew. Apparently, someone had tipped off a local investigative reporter who specialized in HOA corruption. She introduced herself as Jasmine Park, and after a quick interview in front of my boat, she asked to see the documentation I'd collected. Her eyebrows raised as she flipped through pages. "You weren't kidding," she muttered. "This is textbook overreach." The report aired that night on the 6 o'clock news. Vanessa's face, red and flustered from a previous HOA meeting, filled the screen alongside a headline. Lakeview HOA under fire. Residents accuse president of tyranny. That was just the beginning. The next morning, 2 news vans were parked down the street. My phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, questions, and, surprisingly, more evidence. A neighbor named Steve had worked for the property management firm that serviced the HOA. He revealed Vanessa had pushed out the previous company and replaced it with a firm her cousin owned, one that charged double the standard rate. I forwarded the details to the reporter, and she promised a follow-up segment. Meanwhile, my lawsuit picked up speed. With multiple plaintiffs now joining the complaint, our attorney requested a temporary restraining order to suspend all HOA actions until the matter was settled. Vanessa panicked. That evening, she sent out a frantic email to the community, declaring all the allegations baseless and accusing residents of launching a witch hunt against her for simply doing her job. Nobody bought it. The very next day, someone hacked into the community bulletin board and posted screenshots of Vanessa's HOA chat logs. Apparently, she'd been mocking residents behind their backs, calling us lazy retirees and suburban crybabies. It was the final straw. A petition for her removal spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, over 75% of the homeowners had signed it. But Vanessa still had one desperate card left to play. That night, I saw her talking to 2 men near her garage. They wore matching polos with a cleaning service logo, but something about them felt off. Later, I checked my security footage and saw them near my driveway, glancing at Blue Justice. Whether she was planning another towing stunt or something more drastic, I wasn't going to let her get that far. I sent the footage straight to my attorney and filed for a restraining order. My background may have been law enforcement, But now the next morning brought an eerie quiet to the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, Vanessa wasn't seen pacing with her clipboard or glaring from her porch. Instead, her house looked sealed shut, blinds drawn, as if hiding from the mess outside. But it was too late for silence to save her. That very day, we received confirmation from the county courthouse. The restraining order against her had been granted, and an emergency hearing was scheduled for the HOA board's future. The letter was printed and posted on the community notice board, right next to the petition for her removal, which by now had collected signatures from nearly every household in Lakeview. Neighbors were no longer whispering behind curtains. They were meeting in driveways, talking openly, exchanging documents, emails, and screenshots. Mr. Chun, the quietest of us all, had compiled a list of every financial transaction from the last 6 months, and what we found was astonishing. Vanessa had authorized the repainting of common area benches for $8,000, twice the market value, and the contract had gone to her brother-in-law. She also approved a security system upgrade for the clubhouse that no one had seen installed. And then came the receipts. Her HOA-issued credit card had charges from high-end salons, gourmet food deliveries, and one particularly telling transaction for a weekend at a luxury spa. But even as we build our case, Vanessa wasn't done scheming. 2 days before the hearing, I received a cease and desist letter, a thick, official-looking packet accusing me of slander, defamation, and inciting rebellion among the residents. I laughed. The letter was riddled with typos and barely formatted. Her cousin's property firm's name was stamped at the bottom, not a licensed attorney's office. I pinned the letter on my fridge and then emailed it to the investigative reporter, who gladly read snippets of it aloud in her next segment. That night, the story went regional. Not just HOA corruption, but how a retired law commissioner had been targeted for parking his own yacht in his own driveway. The public outrage was instant. Thousands of comments flooded in online. Some from lawyers offering help, others from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Vanessa had underestimated how many people had suffered under HOA tyranny and how many were ready to cheer for someone standing up to it. The following morning, I awoke to flashing lights again. But this time, it wasn't my boat getting towed. It was officers arriving at Vanessa's home with a subpoena. Not just for the hearing, but for records requested by the Office of Community Governance, who had launched their own investigation after the media exposure. Vanessa came out wrapped in a shawl, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, her usual confidence deflated. The officer handed her the papers and said something quietly. Her hands trembled. Word spread fast. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors, and none of them favored her. Someone leaked the internal audit report, a 37-page document full of irregularities, forged emails, missing funds, and manipulated voting records. That evening, we gathered in the community center, the same place where she once held meetings that no one dared to attend. This time it was packed, chairs filled, people standing in corners. The air buzzed with tension, anticipation. I was asked to speak, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I addressed the neighborhood not as a victim, but as someone determined to lead them toward change. I spoke about accountability, about power misused under the guise of rules, and about how silence allows corruption to grow. The room was quiet, focused, not a single phone buzzing, not a single whisper. And then I told them my next move. I was forming an oversight committee made up of volunteers from the neighborhood to ensure this never happened again. Not just here, but in any HOA we could reach. We'd use our story to push for policy reform at the state level. Vanessa may have tried to bury my boat, but she ended up raising an army. The room erupted in applause, some people standing, clapping harder than I'd ever heard in this sleepy neighborhood. But as we wrapped up the meeting, an anonymous envelope was slipped under the door. Inside were copies of email threads between Vanessa and a towing contractor. Emails that showed she had not only ordered my boat's removal, but had tried to sell it to cover her administrative costs. That crossed every line. Now it wasn't just HOA misconduct. It was criminal. I took the envelope straight to the DA's office, where an old colleague of mine promised it would be handled swiftly. Vanessa's time was running out, And for once, she didn't control the clock. The day of the hearing arrived like the final act of a long, chaotic play. The courtroom wasn't packed with strangers. It was filled with neighbors. People I'd lived beside for years, many of whom had barely spoken to each other before all this started, now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the same mission: hold Vanessa accountable. She walked in 10 minutes late, her hair tied tight, lips pursed, dragging a rolling file case behind her like a badge of desperation. Her once confident stride was now stiff, like every step came with the weight of 1,000 regrets. She tried to avoid eye contact, but every glance landed on someone she'd wronged. The judge called the session to order and asked for opening statements. Our lawyer was sharp, steady, and calm. He laid everything out with precision: the unauthorized towing, the financial irregularities, the abuse of power, the false fines, the harassment. And then he handed over the folder with the most damning evidence: the emails where Vanessa had attempted to sell my yacht, a registered and insured private property, without a court order or owner's permission. Vanessa's face dropped. Her lawyer, clearly someone she hired last minute, fumbled through his notes and tried to argue miscommunication and community standards. But the judge wasn't buying it. When he saw the forged HOA voting dates and the personal spa expenses charged to HOA funds, his expression shifted from neutral to disappointed. Midway through the hearing, something unexpected happened. The judge paused, looked out into the crowd, and invited any impacted residents to speak. One by one, they stood. Mrs. Diaz talked about her potted plants and the $300 fine. Mr. Chen read a statement with trembling hands about being fined for phantom noise complaints. The Harpers described how they felt scared in their own home, simply for expressing who they were. Even quiet old Mrs. Lansbury, who everyone thought didn't care about HOA matters, shared how Vanessa had ordered her to repaint her door 3 times in one summer. Every voice added weight. Every story was another stone on Vanessa's collapsing defense. It was my turn. I stood slowly, glanced once at Vanessa, not with anger, but with the kind of calm you get when justice is within reach, and told my story. Not just about the boat. I spoke about what it meant to live in a community, about the difference between rules and control, about how HOAs were meant to protect, not punish. And I ended with one line that seemed to echo through the courtroom. She didn't just tow a boat. She tried to sink trust. The judge didn't even take a recess. In less than 10 minutes, he declared Vanessa's presidency null and void, imposed a fine, ordered a full audit, and referred the matter to the district attorney for further investigation into possible criminal charges. She tried to protest, tried to speak, but her words crumbled under the weight of everything that had come out. Her lawyer patted her shoulder and packed up silently. The courtroom doors opened, and a rush of relief swept through the residents like wind through leaves. It was over, or at least her part was. But for us, it was just beginning. That week, the HOA held a special election, and I declined every request to run. Instead, I nominated someone better. The Harpers, a couple who had once feared speaking up, now became co-presidents with a focus on inclusion and transparency. The HOA's first act? Officially banning unauthorized towing unless approved by a full board vote and a written court order. The yacht, my blue justice, was given a proper home again. But more than that, the neighborhood changed. People started talking. Kids played in yards without their parents worrying about grass length. Mrs. Diaz hosted a community garden workshop. The Harpers added a free library stand at the park entrance. Someone put up a bench under the willow tree near the lake, and no one dared complain. And me? I found peace in small things again. A quiet morning coffee beside my yacht, the sound of laughter from across the street, and the sight of Vanessa's old house, now for sale with a pending offer sign, standing empty. A month later, I got an invitation to speak at a statewide HOA reform summit. Our story had made waves far beyond Lakeview. News outlets kept calling. Emails poured in from across the country. People were tired of being bullied by systems meant to serve them. I accepted the invite, not as a victim, not even as a commissioner, just as a neighbor who refused to stay quiet. The HOA may have towed my yacht, but in the end, they couldn't sink my resolve, And Vanessa didn't just lose power. She lost the community she tried to control. And we didn't just win a case. We reclaimed our neighborhood.